Welcome to this chess video, everyone. But let's get into this really good game where white played over 80% accuracy and black played over 90%. Yet even here we can still find improvements. Now this game was played on Lead Chess, and so on chess.com this is probably about 1700 rating or so. So it's still a pretty high level game. So it starts off as a Ruy Lopez, kind of like this. And then we have a6, this common way of playing it. And now we have pawn to d3. And so this is the Anderson variation of the Ruy Lopez. It's mostly about understanding the common ideas. For those who don't know, common ideas in this opening are usually c3, bringing the bishop back at some point, probably pushing d4. This knight will usually go here, sometimes back to f1 and then go to either g3 or e3, and maybe long term end up on f5. There's much more to the deep Ruy Lopez opening than just this, but this should give a rough idea how this opening usually goes. d6 was played and this is still fine, and now I think we get to the first real critical moment of the game. Here white chose to play castling, and they wrote in their annotations that they were not scared of this bishop pin, because they don't really have way to add pressure. This knight can't move forward because of the pin, and even if they break the pin with something like pawn to b5, this square isn't really a problem because c3 can always kick it away. And if all of that fails, then this knight can just be reinforced by this knight, or we can even just kick away the bishop with h3. But right now, I think we would prefer to keep these pawns very close to our castled king. The next move was pawn to g6, and this is where our viewers' theory ended. They thought this might be inaccurate, and of course it definitely is. The reason why is, similar to us not wanting advanced pawns, now they have weak dark squares because they've pushed their one pawn to a light square. They can fianchetto their bishop and try and cover those squares, but this bishop may not be best located on this diagonal, blocking the scope of their bishop. And so our viewer was on the right track here, but I think this is where they slightly slipped. They said they kind of doubted this move, but they went for h3 now. They shared in their annotations that they were considering pawn c3 and d4 after this. But mentally it seems to me that they were on the right track and they were trying to avoid playing h3. They knew why, but maybe they didn't quite feel comfortable with that position yet. And then you kind of go back to your old habit. So as playing the role of the chess coach here, I'm going to suggest, why not instead of h3, just play c3? The exact idea you were thinking about earlier. This bishop can always come back to c2. You can also push d4 in the long term, and I think white is doing really well here. If we take a look at what the engine recommends, remember c3 was trying to prepare d4, the engine has another line which is also kind of interesting. That line is bishop captures c6 check while they still have time to do so, capturing back, but then you play d4 immediately. It is not about the doubled pawns, that is really not a big deal here. In fact, this pawn is actually an asset because it could help support the center, and black's half-open file might actually do something tying down this bishop. The real purpose of this was to remove the knight defending d4 and then play d4 immediately. Of course, if black takes, this is completely fine. And if we go back a bit, black never really wants to capture here, as I'm sure most players are familiar with, because long term we'll get a rook or something to e1 and then we'll pin that knight. In fact, the engine line goes like this, with trading queens, rook to e1 also winning for white, but even stronger here is queen to e2, and the best move being f5. But then after knight c3, black is still under pressure, their king is out in the open, and white definitely has the advantage here. But alright, h3 is not terrible, it's just those little details that could have been improved. So the game continues bishop g7, rook e1, which is pretty solid. I'm still a fan of playing c3 and going for d4. We never mind them taking here first because then we can pin the knight. And so rook e1 maybe wasn't exactly necessary, but it's still a useful move. Game continues like this, we're going for the c3 idea now, and we're back on track. d4 is finally played, we've got a really good setup here, and even though it's about equal, I really like how white is playing this. Black gets their queen off the back rank, so now they are fully developed with the rooks connected, and so now we're kind of at a critical juncture. How do you continue from here? I'm personally still a fan of bishop to c2, relocating, but other developing moves like knight b to d2 are also pretty solid. Maybe we'll go to f1 like we commented earlier, but we just have to be aware that there isn't really a rush to play this knight maneuver, and we're not exactly going for the f5 square now that it's defended by this pawn. So we'll probably end up with this knight going to either e3 or g3, and then we'll probably be sitting there for quite a while. In the game, d5 was played, which I also like, but it's a very different idea. We're trying to gain a little bit of central space, probably play c4 at some point and secure this extra room. And now the nature of the game kind of reminds me a lot more of the King's Indian defense. Now, of course, what I'm referring to is mostly these pawns here, and probably white bringing this pawn up to c4. Black will usually be playing to play their pawn to f5, and in some lines even end up pushing to f4. Let me show real briefly how this King's Indian defense would look. Give a game example like this. We're not going to go through the whole game, just to look at the opening moves. It'll usually go something like this, and then probably a developing move like bishop e3, and then very thematic is either c5 or e5. And in both cases, when one of them is played, let's play e5 in this case, Usually d5 is played, try and keep the center closed, gain a little bit of space. Now the reason I played this move instead of c5 is to illustrate the point that we have this, their pawn's here, and we have this pawn on c4. They may be pushing to f5, and we compare this to here, you may see the similarities. Real game continued like this, and I really liked the move pawn to c4 to try and get that setup we talked about. Instead, they traded bishops and then went for this, which is also fine. I wouldn't have necessarily traded bishops because if they take, then we have a queen here. And that is not a problem for us because I want to be playing on the queen side knowing that they're going to be playing on the king side. We're kind of helping ourselves get an extra piece to the side of the board we want to be playing on anyway. Now if I go back one ply right before the c4 move, I want to explain real briefly why we want to be playing on the queen side and why black wants to be playing on the king side. This is all connected to pawn structure. Which way are your central pawns pointed? In this case, we look at black's central pawns, and you could even kind of look at this, kind of part of the pawn chain. Both these pawns especially, even if you don't count this one, are pointed towards white's king. And so generally speaking, from a pawn structure standpoint, black may want to be advancing and playing on the king side, or at the very least getting pieces over there. We look at the exact same thing from white's perspective, and their pawns are pointed towards the queen side. So generally they'll want to play on the queen side. Maybe moves like b4, c4, maybe even c5, maybe even a4, and we're going all out and trying to gain space on that side of the board. Now after the move c4, we'll notice that these pawns are kind of pointed this way, as well as these pawns this way, so which way do you go then? And in a situation like that, you could really make a case for playing on either side of the board. I kind of like the idea of playing the queen side of moves like b4 and then c5 being prepared, but just know that playing on the king side was a valid option. Maybe moves played on the king side would look like bishop to e3, queen d2, and then maybe this bishop could go here or here, depending on the position, and we may try and bring in our other pieces, something like knight to g5. But this is all very heavily dependent on where their pieces and pawns are located, so I don't want to get too bogged down in the specifics. Let's return to the actual game that was really played, which was f5. Again, a move that we predicted based on the pawn structure. It's a very thematic move, the King's Indian defense, and it's going to be a thematic move here. Knight c3 I like a lot, and now they're playing f4, which kind of closes down the center, makes it a little bit easier for them to advance these pawns safely, because the biggest danger of having a pawn in front of your king advance, like the f-pawn, is the fact that there's now square weaknesses along this diagonal. But because white's pawns are here and the center is closed, there's a little bit less danger that black's king has in this exact position. Now objectively the game is about equal here, but we can see black's space advantage, and their very obvious moves coming, kind of a little bit scary. So even though it's objectively equal, I think white is already a little bit on the defensive. And here the move was rook to b1, which is a really good move, but their annotations said that they can't clearly explain why this move is played, and that they were a little bit scared of the incoming attack on the king side. But let's go back and let's look at some alternatives, because whenever I get to a game and I'm analyzing, there's definitely going to be positions I don't know what to do, and so that's where you start looking for alternatives in the analysis board afterwards. What other plans could you have possibly missed? Of course b4 makes sense, but what about playing pawn to a4? Let's say we go a4, they just advance their pawns on the king side, we can play a5. Now we can play b4 ourselves, and we're actually a little flexible. We could play c5, but we could also play b5, and we're definitely gaining space on that side of the board. If we go back to the a4 move, I know a lot of players are probably wondering, what about pawn to a5? That stops b4 and looks like we're losing progress here. But in that case, we can just secure it with b3, they'll try and prepare their kingside attack, and then we can actually play bishop to a3, which is an improvement of what happened a little bit later in the game, because now this bishop is good scope and it is not blocked in by the pawn. Now this is still a fine move. We can't just sit back and play passive moves, we have to play very actively. They played g5, and now knight h2, which is kind of an interesting idea. They're trying to control some of the light squares and stop the pawns from advancing. So I really like how they're handling the position so far. Knight f7, and then pawn b4. Let's go forward a few more moves. c5 is advancing nicely, and then they play a small inaccuracy here. In the game, it was knight captures h6, and then the bishop captured back, but I don't actually know if I love this move as much. I would actually recommend capturing f6. I think if you run this a little deeper with the engine, it'll probably agree that this is better, because now black is left with a knight on the edge of the board. I would much rather leave that knight that is inactive rather than take away that less active knight. In this case, then we can play the a4 move we had in mind, and we're slowly making progress. But okay, returning to the real game, it did go this way. They captured back the bishop, but then there was c captures d6. And we can see by the mistake icon, the engine does not approve of this move. And it's because it opens up the c file, but are we really in a position to contest the c file? We still have these pieces on the c file. It's not like we're getting a rook or queen there anytime soon. We compare that to the fact that black is actually just one move away from fighting for that file. So what would have been better? I think best was probably to advance b5. We play aggressively, and if they take the d pawn, capturing c5, then we can take this way, they take back, and then knight a4, and this pawn is probably going to be lost. Remember, we can always add pressure to this, something like this right here, and even if they defend with the queen, it's going to be very difficult for them to hold that pawn. We'll probably win back the pawn, and then these pawns are going to be weak as well. If b5 wasn't found because this was a little too nervous for your playstyle, then we go back one, we can just prepare it, play knight to a4. Remember, our queen still defends this square, and now with extra progress here, playing pawn to b5 might be something we want to do. But unfortunately, after here, they just have c takes, and then black probably has long-term control of that file more easily than white does. Now it was knight a4 in the game, of course threatening the knight fork here, so black moves their queen away. Knight b6, good move, it puts pressure on that rook. They move away, and here comes bishop to a3. A little bit of foreshadowing earlier, I mentioned this. We can see that this pawn is actually in the way here, and we don't really want to advance yet, because this isn't really fighting for the c-file. We can't go here because, once again, the pawn. So it's kind of technical, all these little details. But here, this pawn would be actually better on b3. This kind of thing happens when you just combine too many ideas at once. We weren't exactly sure what to do, and so one plan was attacking this pawn. The other plan was kind of this b4, b5 thing, or b4 and then c4 and c5. But when we ended up combining both plans and weren't really sure which to do, we end up with this b pawn here, and then this bishop being blocked by our own pawn. The real game was g4, and then they played a very natural mistake, which was to try and keep the position closed. Almost always that's going to work, and the mindset on it was correct. But the engine sees further and realizes in this position you really can't keep it closed. So with that in mind, instead of that, you probably just had to try and really bite the bullet, go this way, and then queen f3. You're trying to hold. You're probably slightly behind, but at least it's not as bad. The problem with h4 is the engine sees further, seeing this idea, and then even if you try and come back to stop their pawns, the move you really want to play is g3 at some point. But you really can never play g3 because they have this sacrifice, and then this pawn is too strong. And so because of all of that, that's why this pawn, trying to keep the position closed, doesn't quite work here. They just have too many pawns that are advanced really far, and this queen and rook from behind add really good support. Now our opponent let us off the hook. They did not find knight to h5, preparing f3 and g3, but instead they played g3 first. And so now we happily keep the position closed. This pawn might be a little bit too far in the open. Maybe our king will actually have to try and get out long term, because probably a queen is going to capture here, start infiltrating. We have to be a little bit careful. So the game continues, but at this point it's already really difficult to try and hold our exposed king. The game went like this, trying to advance on the queen side still while they play on the king side, but we're slowly getting flushed out. They didn't take this knight, but if they had in the game, it's actually a forced checkmate in 4, pawn to f3, with this checkmate threatened, and if they try and go here to defend the pawn, then this is just checkmate in 1. The best try was to block with the queen, but we can see here this is not going to be enough. Again, can't capture here because checkmate, and so instead king to e2, they'll take here, we have to come back, and then the bishop from h6 helps in this checkmate. You don't have to see all of that, but you just have to see that you're under a massive attack. And they did, which is why they did not take this knight. They play knight f5, which I like, trying to defend. But slowly but surely they push our king out into the open. We don't really have much shelter to hide behind. They just bring more pieces in, and eventually it led to a checkmate very shortly after. The game went like this, and unfortunately it ended pretty quickly. And it really just is those small things adding up over time. And that's those little plans that were on the right track, but just not followed through in the right way. We just need to trust that position a little bit more, and sometimes that's difficult when you don't fully understand all the details. And so h3 was a perfect example of this. We talked about why we should avoid it, the annotations commented it, but then it was played one move later. And here, because h3 wasn't terrible, but not great, I'd probably still avoid it, play pawn to c3, and then go for d4. The exact same idea we had, h3 move excluded. And I think the exact same thing happened once again here at the rook b1 move. Instead of rook b1, we could have played b4 without that move. And maybe that tempo would have helped us with the incoming attack. But there were also other ideas available, such as the a4 move, which I don't know if that was considered or not in the game. But sometimes you just have to laugh it off and then try and learn from those errors. These things are tricky because h3 was not a mistake, and neither was rook to b1. But these are not the best moves, and these small little things add up over time. That's what really separates the intermediate player to an advanced player, or especially once you become a title player. What the higher ratings tend to do much better is play the best move more often, and minimize these small little suboptimal moves. It's really just about finding improvements, and that's true whether that move is a blunder or whether that move is just slightly inaccurate. I hope this game was instructional for everyone, so thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next chess video.